Hello and welcome back. We are going to review a top 10 of sorts of exercise physiology graphs. By the way, all of the graphs come from Dr. Skiba's book here. Incredible book. This is my copy, a picture of it. It is well worn in. All right, let's get started. First graph just brings us all up to speed and on the same page. As we increase exercise intensity, our oxygenation increases in a linear fashion until we reach a certain point where further increases in exercise intensity here no longer increases our oxygenation or oxygen consumption. We hit our VO2 max. Pretty straightforward. Now we can overlay right here. In theory, our oxygenation would be right here, and then we hit our VO2 max for the time being. Let's get rid of that. Let's look at lactate. We'll put lactate in green here. Right here. When we start exercising, we're at a baseline of about, a little bit under 1.0 millimoles per liter. And as we increase our exercise intensity, eventually we hit a deflection here where we get a break in the baseline where we go above 1.0, and that is our lactate threshold, LT1. If we keep exercising, we get a secondary break and another deflection in our baseline, and that is our LT2. That happens at, according to some people, at a lactate threshold of 2.0. Some people call that LT 2.5, and some of the purists out there call that LT 4.0 because they feel you really need to crack into the fours to really, truly appreciate when that next deflection occurs. Mind you, this does occur on a spectrum, so it is more accurately this steady curve going up, but in general, there are two major deflection points. So that is lactate threshold. Pulling in our next graph, this is not from Dr. Skiba's book, but it is a well-known graph in the world of exercise physiology. Let's now overlay ventilation onto this graph, and we'll get a similar break in that deflection right there, and that is our first ventilatory threshold, VT1. And then if we continue to draw that line linearly, it would go this way, and what actually happens is we get a second break that way. That is our VT2. And you can see right here that these overlay pretty well. This second one is a little bit hard to measure unless you're doing a VO2 max test. But your ventilatory thresholds fairly well correlate to your lactate thresholds, and this is nice because it is a bloodless way. You don't need to do any finger pricks to check your thresholds. However, it is somewhat difficult to really appreciate unless you start doing a lot of threshold training. Your ventilation does change. If you're exercising here, you might not be breathing so hard, but once you hit this first threshold, you often switch to that 1 in 4 pattern, 1 breath every 4 steps. So if you're running 1, 2, 3, 4, you take 1 breath, and it sounds kind of like this. Sorry for the funny voiceover there, but that's basically what happens when you're running. Same thing with cycling, 1 breath every 4 pedal strokes. And then when you hit that second one, it gets a lot worse. Now it's often 1 every 2 or even 1 to 1. Now everyone lives on a slightly different physiology and a spectrum here, so it's not a perfect 1 to 4, and then you absolutely switch to 1 to 2 with the different ventilatory thresholds of VT1 and 2, but you'll appreciate a change, and that correlates to your blood lactate level. You don't need to stick your finger or your earlobe to get that measurement. Now, the cool thing is what happens with training is these curves shift to the right. In the upper graph here, once you break from that baseline and you hit your first lactate threshold and you go into the 2s there from your baseline of 1, that correlates to a certain level of power, or miles per hour if you're running, watts if you're on the bike, or for example your 100-yard pace in the pool. That correlates to a certain oxygenation right there. With training, you can shift this entire curve, so I'll now put this in green. So this curve now is delayed and then goes to here. So now that's represented down here in this graph at the same level of oxygenation here and at the same lactate threshold here as in the upper graph. Now you are functioning much better. You're cranking out a higher power or a higher speed in miles per hour for the same level of oxygenation. The other interesting thing is this curve right here also changes as well and shifts. And as you can see here, same oxygenation, you are now going to reach a higher VO2 max. Before, your VO2 max ended here at this level of oxygenation. Now you are much higher. So it's wonderful when these curves shift to the right. And now we get the really fun stuff. This is where science became so cool to me, so interesting to me. This is where we turn our physiology into numbers. This is critical power. Let's say we plot out all our max exercise. We'll put that in red because it stinks to do these exercises. Let's say we exercise as hard as we can for about, 60 seconds to 1 minute, or 120 for 2 minutes. We're going to generate our max power output right about here. And if we plot that out, now we exercise for maybe 4 minutes, 240 seconds, and we get a power output here. Of course, you're going to be able to exercise harder for a shorter time period than here, so the curve slopes down. And then as we go farther and farther out, you can get all the way out here, something like an hour, 3,600. Put this in black now. And this curve eventually stabilizes, and we reach this steady state, where as long as you don't bump over that, you're going to be fine. That is our, bring that in red again, our critical power line right here. As long as while we were exercising and we're increasing our time of exercise, as long as we don't crank our power up too much to bump over this critical power zone, we'll be able to continue exercising for, well, in this case, 1 hour. But in theory, as long as you stay under your critical power, you can exercise for 2 to 4 hours at this pace, which is really incredible. This is your marathon pace. Stay under your critical power, and you can maintain that pace for 2 to 4 hours. What happens, though, if you go above it? You exercise a little too hard, you crank up the power a little too much, and you go over your critical power. You are now going to tap into your W prime, and this is a horribly drawn battery, but I'm trying to make an example of a battery here. This is a finite reserve. Your W prime is your battery. If you stay above this zone, you're going to drain your battery reserves, and eventually you are just going to crash. You're going to be, out horizontal, out for the count, because you drained your battery and you got nothing left. Interestingly, how math works, if you go as hard as you can for, say, 2 minutes, and you calculate what this amount is in terms of your finite battery reserve power, if you do the same thing for maybe 5 or 6 minutes, of course, it's going to be relatively at a lower power output, but it is the same battery. And then you can keep going. If you go a little bit farther for 800 seconds, it's going to be a lower power output there, but it is the same finite battery. So that is, well, immutable, so to speak, in the body. That is your finite battery. Stay under your critical power, and you can keep on exercising. The really fun thing is watching how this battery level falls. I hate doing this type of training. We'll put it in green first. Might be a little confusing here, but on the right side, y-axis, is your power level, and on the left is your battery that is, well, unfortunately draining here. So we'll go to the green here. Let's say we start exercising at time 0 and we go in this direction. We have to generate a certain similar amount of power. You can set it on the bike. So let's go at 350 watts, which is pretty darn hard. You go for a prescribed period of time, and then you rest. You bring that right down to 0, and then you rest for a little bit, and then you come right back up, crank it up, and go at 350 again. And then you just keep repeating that over and over again. What is going to happen, since you're above your critical power, your battery is going to drain. In that little rest period, it does recover a little bit, but then when you engage in that next interval, it drains back down again, and it just keeps going down. And you can see here that every time you bump above your critical power, you cannot recharge your battery fast enough, and eventually you're going to get to the point that you have nothing left in your battery, and then you know what happens. Out for the count. Bleh. And you don't want to go above that. That is your battery, and you don't want to go dead. You don't want to bonk. You don't want to redline. You don't want to crash. You don't want to hit the wall, whatever term you want to use. I love how the math plays out in terms of the physiology of our bodies. Now, the next three slides, which are almost the last ones here, is where everything becomes just so elegant and beautiful here. You can overlay graph upon graph. Here is our critical power. Should be pretty familiar with that by now, represented right there. This is roughly your LT2, or kind of that maximal lactate steady state, as long as you don't go above that. Here is roughly your LT1. This is your cruising speed for maybe 2 to 4 hours, your marathon pace. Here, your critical power for most of us, plebeians, so to speak, like me, you can maybe do that for about 20 to 40 minutes. If you are extremely well trained, you can usually maintain that in studies for about 45 to 65 minutes, but gosh, that is pretty darn rare to do that. So these are much shorter distance races. This critical power, put over here, is usually closer to your time trial, 40K bike ride if you're well trained, or in running your 10K race, your 6-mile running race. You just can't maintain that speed running as hard as you can for 6 miles for longer than, well, about this time here. If you take it easy and train in the moderate domain and exercise in that moderate domain, you're going to mainly be using type 1 fibers. You're mainly going through oxidative pathways and using a heck of a lot of fat. Once you break that first lactate threshold and dip into critical power, now type 2A fibers come into play. Glycogen starts to get burned, and if you are not careful, you'll start to slowly creep in to the next phase. And if you bump over that critical power, here comes all the anaerobic metabolism pathways right here. CO2 goes up, H plus goes up, lactate goes up, and you go down. Recall my horribly drawn dude crashed at the side because he went too far too fast. And then, of course, if you're trying to do a VO2 max test, you're eventually going to hit a peak. If you just go for pure power, like basically think you're doing squat exercises with 100 pounds, that kind of neuromuscular power, you're going to get into the extreme domain, technically speaking, above your VO2 max. Here is another way to draw this out. If we're looking at oxygenation, we'll put that in green right there. If you start exercising, eventually you'll reach a steady state. Oxygenation never increases. You stay below your LT1, and you can exercise for 2 to 4 hours. That's your marathon right there. Once you learn what that pace feels like and learn what that oxygenation, so to speak, feels like in terms of your ventilation and your ventilatory thresholds, you can hang in this domain right here. What if you jump into the heavy domain? Well, at first, your oxygenation comes up and then tries to stabilize, and you feel like, I'm doing okay. And this is when that same pace suddenly gets much harder. You get this slow secondary rise. This is called the VO2 slow component, where you went, well, bit off a little more than you can chew. You went above your lactate threshold, creeping up into your maximal lactate steady state. This is the danger zone. That's why it's called the heavy domain instead of moderate exercise. This is your long, slow rise that you can do 2 to 3 hours. This you cannot sustain. So if you dip into this area, first oxygenation tries to stabilize, but then it bumps back up, and eventually it reaches the stabilization as long as you can stay under that critical power. But what if you go beyond that and start dipping into your battery? VO2 rises again, tries to stabilize, but never really does, and then continues going up, 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 up until you hit your VO2 max, and then you crash. Now, what happens if you say, well, the heck with this, I'm just going to go an all-out sprint right here? Well, you're just going to crash and burn and get exhausted before you even reach your VO2 max. This basically is like doing the 400 meters. You were just going absolutely all out, or maybe even better, put the 100 meters. I mean, you're barely, you don't even really need to breathe. Some people that are doing those underwater, I can't remember the Olympian that did this, but he made it famous for not coming up for air at all in his short distance swim. He is basically exercising in this domain here. If you are going to not go crazy and go this far and crash before you can finish your race, if you're basically wanting to race in this graph here, this is basically your 1 mile race going all out. Or some people, the 800 meters. Gosh, I hated the 800 meters. It was terrible. And now I know why. I was basically trying to exercise at my VO2 max. It's terrible. This, your critical power or MLSS, this is maybe more like your 1 hour or 20 to 40 minute pace like we were talking about before. Maybe your 10K running race if you're well trained. And then this is your marathon. And the graphs continue to amaze me. It is so incredible just how beautiful your physiology overlays one onto the other. Here we are exercising at progressively increasing exercise intensity. And as we go, first our type 1 fibers get recruited and then eventually they max out. Interestingly enough, right when we hit our first lactate threshold, our body says, whoa, wait a minute, I need more power. In come type 2A fibers, which is why training at your lactate threshold is pretty cool, because we're now incorporating type 2A fibers, not just using type 1. But this is where the fine detail comes in. If we can get within this little happy zone, which is not happy when you're training, this maximal lactate steady state before things go haywire and we bust through critical power, we can now max out these type 2A fibers and get the maximum amount out of our training by exercising more and more right at our critical power. Of course, once we blast through that, we say all hands on deck in terms of our muscles, and the type 2X fibers have to come into play. These are not oxidative. These guys do not know how to use oxygen very well. They are heavily glycolytic, if I can spell, and they do not exercise well in terms of running, racing, cycling, and whatnot. These are more of our bench press muscles. These are our squat thrust muscles. These things are not going to be very effective when we're trying to run a race. If someone is behind you and they have blown past here and recruiting type 2X, you can hear them. I mean, they are smashing, plodding along, hammering down, because those muscles don't know how to run well. They're really used for mashing, and you can hear them behind you just smashing away, and they're basically getting ready to crash and burn. So if you train well and find out both of your lactate thresholds and dance right in between, man, you can max out your physiology. What is the end result of all this? Well, for example, if you are running at this particular speed, and this is you right here, this is your level of oxygenation. If this is you pre-training and this is you post-training, you can shift a curve. At that same speed, you're now consuming less oxygen, you're more efficient, and you can go for longer. You can just keep on running. Or if you wanted to go back up at that same level of oxygenation, well, now you can run at a much faster speed and you can finish your race faster. This will end with the last slide here. Just makes it so beautiful in terms of conceptualizing things. This is where we start out in picture A here. This is us, and this is our peak performance. We can get to here. First, we, of course, have to build our base. This is why we have to get fit to be able to run. We can't run to get fit. We got to do the work at the gym to be able to build that base to tolerate running or cycling or swimming. And this is, in theory, as high as we can go if we raced at our critical power. This, of course, as you can see, is our VO2 max. Now, as we get more fit and our body gets in more shape, we grow, and our head starts to reach the ceiling of our critical power. And that's great. We learn to exercise closer and closer to our critical power, and our performance, represented here, goes up. But once we hit that, we've reached that first stage of training. We say, wow, this is great, but I want to keep going. How do I perform better? Well, now we need to train specifically at critical power to raise that bar, and that is represented here. Then as we increase, our performance grows incredibly, and we are usually very happy people. Once you get to elite status and want to be a professional, after you've maxed out your critical power, then you need to go back to the drawing board and do very specific exercises that try to raise your VO2 max again, and then go back and train at the new percentage of that VO2 max at that new critical power level to further grow. That's how you raise your roof and get more fit.